May 13th, 1942. The waters of the Gulf of Mexico are black and unusually calm. Off the coast of Florida, the Mexican oil tanker Potrero de Llano cuts through the waves, her lights blazing. She isn't hiding. She's neutral. Painted proudly on her hull is the green, white, and red tricolor of Mexico, illuminated by floodlights, so no submarine commander could possibly mistake her for an enemy. But at 11:55 p.m., the night erupts. A torpedo from the German U-boat U-564 slams into the tanker's side. The explosion is a pillar of fire that could be seen for miles. Within minutes, the ship is a skeleton of burning steel. 13 Mexican sailors are killed instantly. The survivors are left bobbing in oil-slicked water, watching their world go up in flames. In Mexico City, the news struck like a lightning bolt. For decades, Mexico had watched the world tear itself apart from a distance. But now the war has come to their doorstep. The people are no longer just observers, they are targets, and they are ready to hit back. Welcome to World War II Obscura. The sinking of the Potrero de Llano, followed quickly by another tanker, the Faja de Oro, changed everything. Mexico wasn't a global military powerhouse in 1942, but it was a nation with a deep sense of honor. President Manuel Avila Camacho didn't just file a protest. He declared a state of war against the Axis powers. But how does a nation that hasn't fought a foreign war, in nearly a century contribute to a global mechanized conflict? The answer lay in the sky. Mexico decided to form an elite unit, the Mexican Expeditionary Air Force, FAEM. At its heart was the 201st Fighter Squadron. These weren't just pilots. They were the Aztec Eagles, a handpicked group of 300 men, pilots, mechanics, and support staff, who were about to take the fight 9,000 miles away to the Pacific. The stakes were higher than just military victory. Mexico was asserting its place in the world stage. For the pilots, the mission was personal. They weren't just flying for the Allies. They were flying to prove that Latin American nation could stand shoulder to shoulder with the giants. In late 1944, the men of the 201st boarded a train headed north, their destination the United States. To fight the Japanese, they first had to master the most powerful single-engine fighter in the American arsenal, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Imagine these men coming from the high-altitude airfields of Mexico, suddenly standing beneath the shadow of the Jug, the nickname given her by pilots and crew. The P-47 was a beast. 7 tons of steel, 8 50 caliber machine guns, and a massive 2,000 horsepower radial engine. It was twice the size of anything they had flown back home. But as they settled into the training bases in Randolph Field in Texas and Pocatello in Idaho, the pilots realized the P-47 wasn't their only obstacle. Gaining acceptance as equals was a daily ordeal. Despite being Allied officers, the Mexican pilots were barred from officers' clubs, restaurants, and other public places. By March 1945, their training was over. The 201st reassembled in San Francisco and boarded the SS Fairhowe, a transport ship that would carry them across the vast Pacific. The journey was weeks of cramped quarters and the constant rhythmic hum of the ship's engines. When they finally pulled into Manila Bay on April 30th, they didn't find a tropical paradise. They found a city in ruins. The smell of smoke and decay hung over the Philippines. The squadron was assigned to Porac Field, an airstrip carved out of the jungle near Clark Field on the island of Luzon. The conditions were brutal. The Philippine sun was so relentless that by midday, the metal skin of the P-47s became a branding iron. Mechanics like Sergeant Gennaro Romero Parra recalled that the engine cowlings were so hot they literally could not touch them with their bare hands. Yet they worked through the heat, often using their own shirts as rags to handle tools that were burning their palms. The 201st was attached to the American 58th Fighter Group. At first, the Americans were skeptical. They handed the Mexicans their worst planes, the war-weary Thunderbolts that had already seen hundreds of hours of combat. But the Mexican mechanics were wizards with a wrench. In a matter of weeks, they had these junk airplanes running so perfectly that American commanders began arguing over who would get the planes back when the Mexicans were done with them. Then came June 1st, 1945, the day of the baptism of fire. The mission was a dive bombing run near Subic Bay. A flight of 4 P-47s led by Lieutenant Carlos Garduño Nunez took off to strike a Japanese ammunition dump at Vigan. Among them was the youngest pilot in the squadron, 20-year-old Second Lieutenant Fausto Vega Santander, known affectionately as Cacho. The target was tucked into a valley surrounded by steep ridges. Garduño rolled his jug over and plummeted toward the earth. He released two 1,000-pound bombs, the G-force pinning him into the sea as he pulled out of the dive just 500 feet above the water. As he climbed, he looked back to see the black smoke of a successful hit, but then he saw something else, a roiling ring of white water at the beach just 300 feet from the shore. Fausto Santander was gone. The official report called it a training accident, a mechanical failure, but for decades the pilots who were there told a different story. Lieutenant Moreno Areola, who was flying right behind Cacho, claimed he saw the plane get hit by Japanese anti-aircraft fire near the cockpit before it veered into the sea. Whether it was a mechanical fluke or an enemy shell, the result was the same. The Aztec Eagles had lost their first man. The death of Vega Santander didn't break the squadron. It hardened them. Throughout June and July, the 201st became the flying artillery for the American ground forces pushing through the mountains of Luzon. They flew under the guidance of ground controllers with call signs like Baby and Bunny, dropping 1,000-pound bombs on Japanese troop concentrations hidden in the thick jungle foliage. These weren't easy missions. The terrain of northern Luzon was a nightmare of jagged peaks and deep ravines. The pilots had to fly low, often strafing at treetop level, where a single miscalculated coordinate or a momentary lapse in concentration meant slamming into a mountainside. On one mission, 1-16, Lieutenant Samano Pina spotted an enemy convoy on a secondary road near Palawan. He didn't wait for ground controllers. He dove, the roar of his .850 calibers drowning out the world as he raked the trucks. He saw the flames rise from a vehicle right in front of him, pulling up at the last second with the heat of the explosion nearly licking his wings. The technical toll was constant. One pilot found himself assigned to a P-47 that the ground crew nicknamed the smelly plane because of an unbelievably bad odor in the cockpit. The pilot didn't care. He'd just grin, ask, "Fuel pump okay?" and take off. On one flight, his windshield was suddenly covered in oil when a gasket blew. He landed, the mechanics fixed it, and the next day he was back at it, asking about the fuel pump and disappearing into the clouds again. As the war entered its final weeks, the 201st was given its most dangerous assignment yet, a long-range strike against the island of Formosa, modern-day Taiwan. This was a 600-mile flight over open water in a single-engine airplane. To make the distance, the P-47s were loaded with extra fuel tanks on the belly and under one wing, with a massive 1,000-pound bomb hanging off the other wing. It was a pilot's nightmare. The plane was lopsided, heavy, and unstable. Lieutenant Amado Castro Almanza recalled the terrifying moment he reached the target. As he dived and released his bomb, the sudden loss of weight on one wing caused his P-47 to snap into a violent barrel roll that caught him completely by surprise. The plane whipped around the horizon, spinning wildly. He managed to wrestle the aircraft back to level flight only a few meters above the ground. He manually keyed his radio to warn the pilots, "Watch that roll." By the time the atomic bombs were dropped and Japan surrendered in August, the 201st had flown 59 combat missions already. They had dropped hundreds of tons of bombs and fired tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition. They had proven they could fly, fight, and die with the best in the world. But the story doesn't end with a ceasefire. After the surrender, a group of Mexican officers, including Lieutenant Luis Prat Ramos and Captain Castro Almanza, were sent to Tokyo as part of the occupation forces. They were the first Mexican soldiers to ever set foot on Japanese soil as victors. They stayed in buildings attended by Japanese girls who had learned that Americans loved coffee. Every time the girls refilled a cup, they would bow. When the Mexican commander began bowing back to the girls, Lieutenant Ramos couldn't help but joke, "Hey, Colonel, we're the conquerors. Why are you bowing to them?" It was a moment of levity after years of tension, a realization that the war was finally over. The Aztec Eagles returned to Mexico in November 1945. They were met with a hero's welcome. Thousands of people lined the streets of Mexico City to see the men who carried their flag across the ocean. In the grand scale of World War II, the Escuadrón 201 was a small unit, but in the history of Mexico they are giants. They represent the moment a nation decided that neutrality was no longer an option when human dignity was at stake. They faced discrimination from their allies and fire from their enemies, and they overcame both. They showed that courage doesn't have a nationality and that the Aztec Eagles could soar just as high as any other wings in the sky. Their legacy lives on in the Mexican Air Force today, where the image of Panchito Pistolas, their cartoon mascot from the war, is still painted on their aircraft as a symbol of their enduring spirit. History is often written by the biggest players, but it's these smaller, lesser-known stories, like the 201st, that reminds us of the true scale of the human experience during wartime. These men didn't just fight for a piece of land. They fought for the right to be remembered. If you want to see more forgotten stories, hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment with a person or mission you think I should cover. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is larger than we could ever imagine.